Imagine walking through a field that was harvested the year before. No tractors returned, no seed drills passed through, no hands scattered grain. And yet, green shoots are already rising from the soil. Not because someone planted them, but because the plant planted itself. For most of human history, this was not unusual, it was expected. Early agriculture did not begin with schedules, machinery, or seed catalogs. It began with observation. People noticed which plants returned on their own. They noticed which grasses dropped seed, survived winter, and came back stronger the next season. They returned to those places. They protected them. They harvested what nature reliably offered again. This was not farming as control. It was farming as relationship. Seeds fell naturally. Some were eaten. Some were destroyed. Some survived. And the ones that survived became the foundation of food security. This is an important point because modern agriculture has reversed the story. Today, we are taught that crops exist only if we replant them, that if a field produces again without intervention, something has gone wrong. That idea is not ancient, it is relatively new. Self-seeding plants were once the reason agriculture worked at all. They spread risk across time. If one harvest failed, not all seeds were lost. If drought came early, later seeds waited underground. If timing was imperfect, the plant compensated. Nature never placed survival into a single moment. Modern systems do. To understand why a self-replanting grain became a problem, we have to understand how modern grain farming is designed. Today's agricultural cycle is rigid by necessity. Fields are cleared completely. Seeds are purchased. Planting happens on schedule. Harvest happens on schedule. Fields are reset. Uniformity is the goal. Predictability is the requirement. Machines depend on crops that behave the same way. Markets depend on harvests that arrive at the same time. Contracts depend on yields that can be forecast months in advance. This system does not reward adaptability, it rewards obedience. A self-seeding grain does not obey schedules. When it matures, it releases seeds gradually, not all at once. Some fall before harvest, some during, some after. Some germinate immediately, others wait, others remain dormant for years. This is not inefficiency, it is resilience. But resilience creates problems for systems built on control. Early farmers noticed that once these grains were established, they were difficult to remove. Leave a field alone and they returned. Switch to a new variety and the old one reappeared. Attempt to clear them and seedlings emerged the following season. In traditional systems, this was an advantage. It meant less labor, less replanting, more reliability. But as agriculture industrialized, that advantage became resistance. Breeding programs wanted plants that held seed until harvest. Mechanization required uniform maturity. Seed companies needed crops that could not reproduce without replacement seed. The self-seeding grain sat directly in the way of that transition. It blurred the line between wild and cultivated. It adapted faster than breeding programs could stabilize. It refused to disappear when told to. And when a system cannot control something, it changes the language used to describe it. What was once called persistent became invasive. What was once called resilient became aggressive. What was once called dependable became a weed. This shift in language mattered. Calling a plant a weed is not a scientific judgment, it is a management decision. It means the plant does not fit the plan. By the mid-20th century, as industrial seed systems expanded, self-replanting behavior became unacceptable. Traits that allowed seeds to fall naturally were bred out. Seed shattering was labeled a defect. Harvest became easier, Control increased. Replanting became mandatory. And once replanting is mandatory, dependency is built into the system. The self-seeding grain did not fail. It simply no longer fit the future being designed. By the time agriculture entered the 20th century, the relationship between farmers and plants had fundamentally changed. Farming was no longer just about growing food, it was about managing systems at scale. Larger fields replaced mixed plots, machines replaced observation, uniformity replaced adaptation. In this environment, plants were no longer valued for their ability to survive, they were valued for their ability to behave. A grain that replanted itself challenged that shift. Farmers working with early industrial systems began to notice a pattern. Fields planted once did not stay empty when abandoned. The grain returned, not randomly, but persistently. Even after clearing, even after plowing, even after switching to other varieties. The plant did not respect boundaries drawn on maps. It crossed fields, it crossed seasons, it crossed breeding lines. For seed developers, this created a problem. Maintaining a uniform variety requires genetic stability. A self-seeding grain introduces variation every time it drops seed. Each generation adapts slightly differently. Over time, the population becomes diverse instead of standardized. From an ecological standpoint, that diversity is strength. From a commercial standpoint, it is instability. Uniform crops make predictable yields. Predictable yields make predictable markets. Predictable markets make financial planning possible. A self-reseeding grain breaks that chain. It does not mature all at once. It does not respond identically to inputs. It does not allow precise forecasting. Instead, it responds to weather, soil, and time. As seed companies expanded, control over planting became central to their business model. Seeds were no longer just saved, they were sold. And to sell seed every year, crops had to be redesigned so they could not easily reproduce on their own. This is where breeding priorities shifted. Seed shattering, once considered a survival advantage, was reclassified as a defect. Plants were selected that held on to their grain tightly until harvest. The ability to reseed naturally was deliberately reduced. The grain that replanted itself did not meet those requirements. It held on to independence too strongly. In extension publications and agricultural advisories, language changed again. Farmers were warned about volunteer growth, about crops that returned uninvited, about grains that were hard to eradicate. The problem was no longer food production, it was control. In several regions, self-reseeding grains were officially discouraged, not because they were unsafe, not because they lacked nutrition, but because they interfered with management. And once a plant is defined as interfering, it is treated as a problem to be solved. Herbicide regimes were developed to eliminate volunteers. Crop rotations were adjusted to suppress them. Fields were cleared more aggressively. Over time, generations of farmers grew up without ever encountering a grain that could replant itself. The idea that crops might return without permission faded from memory. Anything that did was labeled abnormal. This created a cultural shift as much as a technical one. Self-sufficiency began to look like inefficiency. Persistence began to look like resistance. Adaptability began to look like disorder. But these traits never stopped being useful. As farming intensified, new problems emerged. Soil erosion increased as fields were left bare between seasons. Fuel use rose with repeated planting. Costs increased with every required input. Ironically, the very traits bred out of crops were the ones that could have reduced these issues. A self-seeding grain maintains living roots in the soil longer. It reduces erosion. It captures nutrients that would otherwise be lost. It reduces the need for repeated soil disturbance. But those benefits were secondary to system compatibility. The grain did not fail to produce food, it failed to fit the structure built around it. And so it was quietly pushed aside. No headlines announced its rejection, no bans were declared. It simply stopped being offered. Seed catalogs did not include it. Universities did not prioritize it. Funding did not support it. Silence did the work. Yet biology continued operating on its own timeline. In marginal lands where management was less strict, the grain persisted. In traditional systems that valued continuity, it survived. In research plots, it waited. And while industrial agriculture moved forward, it did so with increasing fragility. Every season required precise timing. Every failure had larger consequences. Every disruption carried higher costs. The grain that replanted itself had been designed for uncertainty. The system that replaced it was not. For a long time, it seemed as if the decision was final. Annual planting became the norm. Seed dependency became standard. Fields were designed to begin at zero every year. And for a while, the system worked, as long as conditions stayed stable. But stability was an assumption, not a guarantee. As the decades passed, cracks began to appear. Soils thinned, erosion accelerated, fuel costs rose, climate patterns became less predictable. The system that had been optimized for efficiency struggled under variability. Droughts arrived earlier or later than expected. Floods disrupted planting schedules. Heat waves shortened growing windows. Late frosts destroyed carefully timed crops. Annual agriculture depends on precision. Nature does not promise it. This is where interest quietly returned to grains that behaved differently. Researchers began asking uncomfortable questions. What happens when planting windows collapse? What happens when seed deliveries are delayed? What happens when fields cannot be replanted on schedule? They looked backward, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Self-seeding grains offered answers that modern systems lacked. A grain that replants itself does not depend on perfect timing. If planting is delayed, it has already planted. If a season fails, dormant seeds remain. If conditions shift, diversity allows adaptation. Instead of betting everything on one moment, it spread survival across many. Modern research into perennial and self-reseeding grains did not emerge from idealism. It emerged from pressure. Soil scientists observed that keeping living roots in the ground reduced erosion dramatically. Agronomists noticed improved water retention. Ecologists documented healthier microbial communities. These benefits were not new discoveries, they were rediscoveries. The traits that once made self-seeding grains inconvenient now appeared essential. But reintegrating them has not been simple. Modern infrastructure is built around annual cycles. Machinery expects uniform maturity. Markets expect predictable harvest volumes. Insurance models expect consistency. A grain that refuses to behave still creates friction. And so, once again, it is not promoted loudly. It is studied quietly, tested cautiously, discussed in research papers more than in fields, because systems rarely reverse direction quickly. Yet something has changed. The language has shifted. Instead of being called invasive, these grains are now described as resilient. Instead of being labeled aggressive, they are called adaptive. Instead of being dismissed as unmanageable, they are studied as risk-reducing. The same traits, different context. What once threatened control now offers stability. This grain did not change, the conditions around it did. And this is the key insight. Many solutions are not rejected because they fail. They are rejected because they solve the wrong problems for the moment. When priorities shift, so does relevance. Today, self-seeding grains are being explored as part of diversified systems, not replacements for everything, but anchors for resilience. They are not designed to maximize short-term yield, they are designed to minimize long-term failure. That distinction matters. A system optimized for maximum output collapses under stress. A system optimized for survival absorbs it. The self-reseeding grain embodies that difference. It does not ask permission to return. It does not wait for approval. It does not care if it is convenient. It grows. And that is why it was never truly eliminated. It remained in places where control was lighter, where observation mattered more than scheduling, where survival mattered more than uniformity. Now, as pressures increase, it is being noticed again, not as a miracle, not as a revolution, but as a reminder. Farming does not have to begin at zero every year. Food does not always require constant intervention, and efficiency is not the same as resilience. The grain that replants itself exposes a simple truth. Some systems are fragile because they demand perfection. Others survive because they expect failure. This plant belongs to the second kind. It was never too weak. It was never outdated. It was simply ahead of a system that was not ready to value what it offered. The knowledge of this grain was not destroyed. It was ignored when it no longer fit. And now, quietly, it is being reconsidered, because biology has always been patient. Some solutions do not disappear. They wait.